All right, welcome back. In this video, we want to talk about counter controlled loops, and that falls into one loop category, that is the for loop. A counter controlled loop is a loop that will execute a specific number of times. I know reading the code that it's going to loop 5 times, 10 times, 20 times. Based on the number of entries in this spreadsheet or whatever it might be, there might be a variable in here that tells us how many times it will run, but it will always run a specific number of times. It's not going to be based on some condition by the user or input or anything like that in the same ways that the condition controls were. It will run X number of times. So let's talk about how we can set that up and what tools we can use to make that work. So let's create a program that will sum all the values from 1 up to a number entered by the user. So let's say the user enters 5. I want to know what 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 is. Okay, if the user enters 10, I want to know what 1 plus 2 plus 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 are if I sum all those digits. If they enter 100, I should get what I want out of that. 5,050 is technically the sum. But either way, let's see if we can kind of figure out what we're doing through the problem. So let's think about what we have here. Let's do a full-blown pseudocode on this one because it's a good problem to have. We'll do a start. We'll make some declarations. Okay. In my declarations, I am going to have a user input. So that'll be the number they entered. So we'll have an integer for a max value, right? That'll be the highest number I can go up to and include. We will have an integer for the counter. I will start the counter at 1 essentially, but I don't have to do that here. I can just leave it as is. And then we'll have an integer for the running total of all the values of counter up to and including max value. We'll start that at 0 so we have something to add into it as we start working our way through. All right, so for my for loop, essentially what it tends to look like is it's going to be something like this. So first let's input our max value, right? And then we'll say for counter starting at 1 up to our max value. For every counter starting at 1 up to our max value, and we'll increment it by ones, we want to essentially do this. I want to take my total, set my total equal to whatever the total was, plus my counter. And I want that to happen repetitively. My counter is going to keep changing. My counter is going to go from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, from 3 to 4, from 4 to 5, 5 to 6, so on and so forth, all the way up to max value, and it will reach max value and use it. My total is going to, whatever it is, get increased by that value and set into the new total. So by the time this is all said and done and this loop has finished executing, I have then effectively summed all the digits from 1 up to max value. Then all I'll have to do is display it. We can stop. That is my looping activity. A for loop does not require a control variable per se. The counter is technically a control variable, but we won't call it that in the same regard as we did with the counter or with the condition controlled loops because there is no real condition here. We're just going to run it a specific number of times from 1 up to whatever max value is. And then we're going to do a bunch of stuff. And there's no incrementation here because it's all kind of handled within the structure of the for loop. I mean, technically, a for loop is nothing more than a while loop. You'll see that it is in the flowchart. It's just a lot of things are happening behind the scenes, and we have this language sort of set up to do this stuff for us. Let's take a look at the flowcharts for this because we can flowchart it in kind of 2 different ways. So let me come up here, let me grab my flowchart symbols, and we'll do it from start to stop. We'll do a start, right? And we will come in with our declarations. Got our integer for our counter, integer for the total, an integer for the input, which is max value, right? Now let's get that information from the user. So let's get some input, right? And then we'll get into how to code the for loop. Now, technically, the for loop is essentially the same as it was before. Here, I will need to make sure that I set the counter equal to 1. So let's do that. So prime it. Okay. We'll come in with a condition. Okay, our precondition. We'll bring in our diamond shape. And we'll say while the counter is less than or equal to, generally always kind of be a less than or equal to unless we're running our for loop backwards, which we'll demonstrate. Max value. A little bigger, move it around. While that's true, again, I tend to use a while loop. We're going to set total equal to total plus counter. Right? I like bringing that down a little, this over here. And then we'll have to do our incrementation. We are going to set counter equal to our counter plus 1. Just increase it by 1 each time. And so just based on this, you can kind of see that the for loop is really not a whole lot different than a while loop. Okay. We're going to come through, we're going to check our condition again. And if it's true, we're going to do these things. We're going to come through, check our condition. If it's true, we're going to do these things. And when it's all said and done, we'll come out here and we will display our total. And we will stop. And so you can totally tell here how the for loop is not a whole lot different in flowchart form as it was is a while loop. So we can write every single for loop as if it's a while loop. So you really only need to master one looping structure. But knowing at least the for loop can help us in a lot of regards, especially in Python, because the for loop in Python isn't necessarily always counter controlled. It can be run that way, but it's actually more sequence controlled. And we'll talk about that more when we start getting into the specifics of code. Now, there is a different way to do this because you can see how this is just so repetitive and similar to the while loop. It's kind of like, why do we do it? We can introduce a new symbol here to kind of take care of a few things for us. And so let's more or less copy this and we'll make some additions or edits to it. So let's bring it over here and let's do it slightly different. So we're still going to have all of our declarations and things like that. We'll input our max value. I'm actually going to take this part out. Okay. And we will reset a few things. I'm actually going to remove this as well. I'm going to bring in a different shape, and it's going to be like this hexagonal shape. Okay, I'm going to attach it right there. Move things around. We'll get this flow line to attach to it properly. Okay, and here I can actually write in some of the things that I want. I can write for, okay, and I'll have to manipulate the text so it goes inside. And I will say my counter equal 1 to max value. And so now it looks a whole lot more like the pseudocode that we wanted. So let's get this styled correctly, which is text bottom. I want that center. Okay. So for counter equals 1 to max value, essentially what I want to do is I want to set my total equal to my counter be increased by my counter. And instead of using the word while or true here, I'm going to write next. So it's like the next iteration as we go through. And then here, I'm really going to drag this back around and reconnect it to my loop so that it just continually does what it's supposed to do. So I keep track of all of that. So I didn't have to need all of these conditions and these incrementations and things of that nature. And now I can bring these things back up and connect them appropriately and start working our way through. So a for loop can be coded and flowcharted a little simpler if you use the right symbols. Using this hexagonal symbol can kind of help you out, but you do need to kind of write in what it's doing. Counter equal 1 to max value. We're going to set the total equal to total plus the counter, and then we're going to increase the counter each and every time. We just know that by the way that it works. If we do have to change our incrementation, we can do that. We could say that it's going to increment by a certain value, and we'll get into some examples of that a little bit later. But essentially, this is a way to design your for loops. You can treat them just like a while loop, or you can use the enhanced version of this shape and start working through it as if it's a regular for loop. So again, just the basics there. We'll talk more specifics as we start working our way through more videos and more examples. But there is your subtle differences in a counter controlled loop and how much easier they can be to work with as opposed to condition controlled when you're doing a specific type of task that has to happen a specific number of times. If you have any questions or comments and you want to talk about it, please feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to help you.